I'd like to call the special meeting of the Lammersville Unified School District Governing Board to order at 5:30 PM. I'm going to move on to item 2, adjourn to closed session. Before adjourning to closed session, is there any member of the public that would like to make a comment related to this agenda item? Seeing none, I'll entertain a motion.
Move to adjourn.
Second.
Based on a motion by trustee Pombo and seconded by trustee Boulay. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? The motion passes with 4 ayes, no nays, and 1 absent. We are adjourned to closed session.
Thank you.
The board is reconvening to open session at 5:58 PM. We will now ask you to join us in saying the Pledge of Allegiance. And before we rise for that, just a reminder that this meeting is being live streamed and recorded, so please turn off your cell phones at this time. All rise, please. I will lead us. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Roll call.
Lisa Boulay,
Here.
Colin Clements,
Here.
Benita Daniel absent, Stephanie Olson,
Here.
David Pombo,
Here.
Student Board Member Devika Vitulani absent.
Item 7, approval and/or corrections to the agenda.
There are none.
Move to approve the agenda.
Second.
On a motion by trustee Boulay and seconded by trustee Clements. All in favor? Any opposed? The motion carries with 4 ayes, no nays, and 1 absent. Item 8, information and discussion items. Item A, California Voting Rights Act presentation and public hearing. Staff report?
Yes, we have Harold Freeman here from Lozano Smith, who will be introducing our topic this evening.
Good evening. Well, I may be taking you through our PowerPoint tonight. I'm guessing that Doug may be stuck in traffic, your demographer. I just texted him, so hopefully he is going to come bursting through in a moment. But I'll at least start in on the materials. I've had the good fortune of seeing this presented last time and being very familiar with it. So I'm actually going to grab this. And just to remind you, as a really quick overview, this is a second in a series of hearings that the board is having. Under the California Voting Rights Act, you have to go through a series of different hearings as you lead to making a decision about having a by-trustee area map, and we'll talk more about what that means. This is the second pre-map hearing, so the second hearing that you have with the public to get any input on what may go into those maps, and then there'll be an opportunity to have 2 post-map hearings where you get to actually see the maps that the demographers prepared. The public is able to weigh in on them. There's a 5th hearing where you then actually make your recommendation on a decision on the map. And from there, that goes to the County Committee on School District Organization. And it's actually the county committee that has the final decision on the map. So with that, I'm going to, if you don't mind, dive into the presentation. I've got to figure out where to point this, though. Is this the right direction? So you see up on the screen, we have not that many different kinds of election systems in California that are defined. The first one is at large, which is what the district currently uses. All people in the district, all voters, vote for all board members in the district. You have from district or residence districts. That is we sometimes call a hybrid. So you may have, for example, a situation where you have 3 trustee areas, but 5 trustees, and those 3 areas elect those 5 trustees. And you have the by-district, or we call it by-trustee area for school districts. And in a by-trustee area system, each trustee area that has been defined and adopted elects their one board member. And that board member is the board member for the entire community, for the entire district still, but only people who live in that trustee area with that board member get to vote on that position. When we talk about these three types, from the standpoint of the California Voting Rights Act, there's really only two kinds, because the legislature has spoken and said anything that is not by district, by definition, is at large. So this hybrid, the number two, for purposes of California law, it's no different than having at-large elections. And you see the note there that the CVRA, the California Voting Rights Act, this was written specifically to encourage by-district elections. And not coincidentally, we've seen about 25% of the school districts in the state now move to by-trustee area elections as a result of that. So the California Voting Rights Act, we reviewed this at the last meeting, or Doug did, the demographer. So we have the Federal Voting Rights Act that has 4 criteria that you look at when you think about whether there's been a violation of Federal Voting Rights Act, or voting rights. And 1965 obviously evokes a particular time period where there was a great deal of attention to this issue in the country, where there was active voter suppression going on, particularly in the South during those time periods. And so the federal courts and the legislature adopted these tests that you look at for when a plaintiff can successfully file a Federal Voting Rights Act. And you see the Gingles test, it's a funny name, that's the name of a US Supreme Court case, that has these 4 criteria. And the 4 criteria being, can the protected class constitute the majority of a district? So put differently, is there a minority group that within a defined area can be 50% plus 1? That's the key part of the Gingles test. Does that group vote as a block? Can you see statistically over time that they've tended to vote for the same candidates or the same measures? Third is, do the voters who are not in the protected class vote in a block to defeat the preferred candidates? So that's this voter dilution where typically the majority population is voting in a block to defeat the preference of the minority group. And then fourth, there's a totality circumstances test where you look at, was race actually a factor? Because you can statistically have all of these things happen and race wasn't a factor. It's just the circumstance of what occurred. The ones that you see crossed out is what the California Voting Rights Act has done. It's removed these 2 standards from consideration. So you really only look at, does the protected class vote as a block? And are the voters who are not in the protected class voting in a block to defeat the preferred candidates of the group, the minority group? By eliminating particularly that first and fourth test, it made it much easier to bring a successful California Voting Rights Act than it is a Federal Voting Rights Act. There's no comparison between the two. So really, now you look to what's called racially polarized voting as those 2 factors. Oh, hi, Doug. I'm going to let Doug set up. I'll do this slide, then we can switch over to you so you can catch a breath. Just to talk about the CVRA impact, I mentioned earlier how many school districts have gone over to by trustee area elections, again, for other types of agencies. We call it by district. And you'll see here, these numbers are really quite large. So about 240 school districts, and that's growing every day. 34 community college districts, over 160 cities. As was pointed out at the last hearing, 1 county board of supervisors, and the reason there aren't more is because they were all by district already. The one that wasn't came over, and over 50 special districts, and that's growing really quickly as well. What's happened in I don't remember the exact number of years, but the 15 or years so, 14 years that the CVRA has been in effect is a lot of litigation. And you see some example of these cases, Palmdale, Santa Clara, Santa Monica, all went to trial on the issue of, was there racially polarized voting? Was the CVRA violated? Palmdale and Santa Clara lost. Santa Monica, a very famous case that's going on now, they lost at the trial level, and then they won at the appellate court level, and then it got reversed at the Supreme Court level, who sent it back for more hearings, so they're going to be at it for quite a few more years. You'll see here Modesto and Palmdale both spent about $1.8 million on attorneys, on defending the case, on demographers, and then they lost. Santa Monica, the numbers are staggering. The city spent, when we say estimated, $7 million so far, I guess by now it's probably well above that. The plaintiffs who won the case at the trial level were seeking $22 million in attorney's fees. So these numbers get very big very quickly. Most CVRA cases settle. Rarely do they go to trial anymore because they all come out the same way. Because again, the CVRA is so, I'm going to use the word biased, which is probably the wrong word, but has a preference for by trustee area elections. And you see the list, I won't read through with you, of sample settlements. Anywhere from the low end, you're talking about $42,000 to the high end, you're talking about $4.7 million. That's the kind of settlements that we're talking about. And you'll see the note there that there's an estimated $16 million in total settlements and court awards so far. That's before Santa Monica gets settled and resolved and taken into account. And the last thing I'll say before then I turn it over to Doug, now that he's caught his breath, is under the CVRA, if a demand letter is sent to a district claiming that there is racially polarized voting and a violation of the CVRA, you then open a narrow window of 45 days to adopt a resolution of intent to move to by trustee area elections, which this board's done. If you don't do that in the 45-day period, there's no cap on the attorney's fees that a plaintiff's counsel can seek. If you do act within the 45 days and then you finish your process within an additional 90 days, which your calendar's scheduled to do right now, the most that a plaintiff's attorney can claim from you, it goes up by inflation, so we never have exact dollars in front of us, but it's about $38,000. So if you look at the sample settlements that are up here, these all came out of that process. The districts that have settled within that process or have gone forward after receiving a demand, generally speaking, won't have to come out of pocket by more than that, roughly $38,000 to a plaintiff's counsel. So enough from the lawyer. I'm going to turn it over to the demographer, who is far more qualified.
Can I ask a question before since you presented the previous slide, can I ask a question on the previous slide? Can we roll it back one slide? So on the point, do the voters who are not in the protected class vote in a block to defeat the preferred candidates of the protected class? The intent of the voters who are not in the protected class doesn't matter. If I'm interpreting this correctly, they could just be voting for their preferred candidate without regard to the preferred candidate. They're just voting the way they want to vote, and it still would trigger this, correct?
Correct, and that's particularly true with the CVRA's elimination of that last bullet point about the totality of circumstances was race a factor. It's just demographics now. It's not intent.
Thanks.
Thank you, Harold. And one of the pleasures of working with Ryan and Harold is we work together so much they can give the slides just as well as I can. So my apologies. I actually thought we were starting at 7. I've been at Mountain Mike's Pizza since about 5:30. So good to be here and with you again. So you just heard the introduction and the background of the law. In terms of the process here, we are on the second initial hearing, that January 29th at the top row. After this hearing, then we'll have draft maps developed that we'll develop based on the criteria that I'll talk about in a minute and any direction we get today or community input we get today. Those maps will be posted for at least 7 days. It's tight with the February 7th hearing, but the rule is at least 7 days. They'll be on the district website, so anyone who wants to check them out, they'll be up there by the 31st. Then that'll lead into a community forum and additional hearings. So we start with a hearing on February 7th, which is the first chance to react to and give direction for any desired revisions to those draft maps, or to possibly narrow down the group of draft maps to some preferred options. Then there'll be the community forum you see there on the 20th, which will be a more informal session to just talk through the maps with anyone interested in coming to that meeting, leading to the board's formal hearing on the 21st and final adoption on the 6th. In terms of the rules for how these lines get drawn, this is all new as of January 1st, as I mentioned the last meeting. So we have the same federal requirements. Those, of course, come first. Equal population, and it is an equal number of people, not equal number of voters or anything like that. It's human beings counted in the census. And for an area like this is growing so fast, keep in mind that it is counted in the 2020 census. So we know they're a couple years out of date. That's just the way the courts have done it to give us a nice concrete number to focus on. Then we have to comply with the Federal Voting Rights Act, and at the same time avoid any racial gerrymandering, which means where race becomes a predominant factor. Harold and Ryan and I will all be working together to make sure that all the plans that come to you either fully comply with that if we draw them, or if they come from a resident and they don't, they'll have a big stamp on them saying voting rights concern. But confident that the maps that you will see will all comply with all three of those rules. Then we have the new California criteria, and these are in prioritized order. So contiguous, the pieces of each trustee area have to touch. It's pretty straightforward. Then minimizing the division of neighborhoods and communities of interest. Communities of interest is a pretty general term that I'll talk about in a minute, but that's the second of the state prioritized criteria is avoiding any divisions of those groups. Then we get following easily identifiable boundaries. It's major roads, rivers, if you had mountains, anything like that, that makes it easy for the voters to understand where their boundaries are. And then the last of the California requirements is to be compact. So don't bypass one group of people to get to another group of people. That's where you see funny shaped districts coming from. You can be not compact if that helps you achieve a higher ranked priority or criterion, because these are in priority order. But when you get down to it, if everything else is equal, then the compactness factor comes in. Then you can see on the right the California prohibition. You shall not adopt election district boundaries for the purposes of favoring or discriminating against an incumbent candidate or political party. And just so folks know, in the drafting of the maps, I actually don't know where you all live, so that's how we're sure that the draft maps are not favoring or discriminating against you. Then if all those factors are equal among two maps, then you can look at future population growth. It's way down on the scale, so it doesn't come into play very often, but if all other things being equal, well then the districts, or the trustee areas in this case, that are expected to grow the fastest, you can underpopulate them only by a couple of % under the federal equal population requirement, but you can underpopulate them by a couple of %. The challenge is that tends to come up most often in a jurisdiction like here, where you know where the growth is going to be, and there's going to be a lot of it, but the reality is just a couple of % of underpopulation is not going to offset that future growth prevailing. In fact, it's not even going to fully compensate for what's already happened, I suspect, in most of these. But it is a consideration that we can take into account after addressing all the other considerations. So a lot of demographic numbers. The key things, I'm not going to go through all this, obviously, but at the top left, we have the total population number. That's where that equal number of people comes from. Then the total population broken down by ethnic group according to the census. And you can see 14% Latino, 21% NH, stands for non-Hispanic. So 21% non-Hispanic white, 7% non-Hispanic black or African American, 55% Asian American or Pacific Islander, and about 1% non-Hispanic Native American. Below that is citizen voting age population. We look at that for Voting Rights Act compliance because it's the measure of eligible voters. But as I talked about at length, I'll just touch on tonight. I talked about it at length at the last hearing, touch on it tonight. The big drop in Asian Pacific Islander percentages from 55% of total population to 30% of CVAP is probably because the citizen voting age data comes from the American Community Survey, which is a separate census study than the 2020 census, and the data lags. So it gets updated every year, so it's slowly catching up. But I think it's much more likely that the Asian American number is just slow to catch up in the census data than, say, almost half of your Asian American population is not citizens. I don't think that's the case, even though at first glance these numbers might look like that. I think that number will be going up very fast every year as each new set of census data come out. Then you've got registration and turnout data. That comes from the state. One thing in those categories, just note, the Latino estimate and Spanish surnamed estimate, be sure not to add those two together. So the Census Bureau has a list of Spanish surnames, and in California, the Bureau has estimated how much those numbers undercount actual Latinos. These are big estimates, obviously. There's definitely margin of error whenever using surname data. But so the number from California using the Spanish surname list is 17%, for example, of voter registrations. If we use that Census Bureau 11% undercount factor, that would bump that up to 19. So you can look at either 17 or 19 It's not that you combine them for 36. The other numbers, Asian surnamed, Filipino surnamed, are from the state database. And then we use some demographic estimates to try to estimate the remainder of the voters and figure out, again, these are ballpark estimates, what percentage are white versus black. Obviously, there's no surnames, surname lists that would allow us to separate white from black voters. Then all the other categories on the right are things that folks can look at if they want to use those demographic factors to identify communities of interest. So is there an area where a foreign language is spoken at home more often than in other parts of the Is there an area with higher income, or one that comes up a lot where there are more renters as opposed to homeowners living in that area? And all of these data are available in maps. I'll show a couple of them, and then the rest are all available on the website. Lost my clicker. There we go. Okay. For example, this is one map showing that citizen voting age population, CVAP. Again, this data is lagged, as we call it. It's a few years behind. But you can see there's more of a concentration of the greens, yellows, and reds, which are the majority Asian American areas, in the southern part of Mountain House. Obviously, there's a lot in the northern part too, where you see the light blues and some yellows, but not as concentrated in the north part of Mountain House, and much more concentrated in Mountain House than out in the more rural areas. Latino population is kind of the flip version of that. Again, there are Latinos, Asian Americans, African Americans everywhere in the school district. The purple areas, though, are 25% or less, because those concentrations are not really going to impact the demographics of a whole trustee area. And what we're really looking for, and especially in our Voting Rights Act analysis, is majority areas. So you can see when you get outside of Mountain House, you get higher percentages, at least in the San Joaquin County side, the yellows and reds, but we're not getting huge numbers. You know, a couple of those areas, the numbers shown are the number of total population in that area. So you get a few hundred people in the yellows and reds, but not huge concentrations or developed communities. Oops. And then these are just examples of those other categories. Using that same color scheme, you can see the percentage who are college graduates. The one thing to keep in mind, though, is that while on the previous slides, the data is available essentially city block by city block in estimates, this data is just available in kind of neighborhood, what they call block groups, chunks. So for example, the Alameda County side is really just 2 data points. So it all looks very uniform because it's green. That's because there are only 2 block groups that we're looking at, and they both have the same range. When you can see a little bit when you get into Mountain House, there's more detail because we have more of these block groups to look at. But you can see college graduates on the left, percentage of households who are renters in the middle. Nothing really jumps out. There is that red area over on the east side, but again, that's not a heavily densely populated area. It's probably one apartment building, I suspect, out there, so it's not going to drive the demographics of a whole trustee area very much, depending on where that goes. And then one that often comes up in school considerations is percentage of households with a child under age 18 at home. Essentially, where are the school kids at home? And you can see that, oops. And you can see that's denser in the southern part of Mountain House and in the areas kind of right around Mountain House. But there are fairly high numbers everywhere. You don't see any purple areas, which we'd see if there was, say, a retired senior community or anything like that. So when we look at that key criterion of minimizing divisions of neighborhoods and communities of interest, first, the neighborhoods piece of it, we do look for community input on this. So we want to know, how do people describe their neighborhood and what are its geographic boundaries? And in particular, when we get to communities of interest, I would say, we're drawing maps, we have to know the geographic boundaries. People might disagree about where their boundaries are. Here you have fairly defined boundaries in Mountain House, not so much outside other than perhaps the city of Tracy territory. And people may disagree on where the boundaries are, especially outside of this area. And that's fine. If there are 2 inputs Well, we'll certainly try to keep the smaller one together, and if we can, we'll try to keep the bigger definition together. But we do need to know that from residents who want us to consider their neighborhood and give that input. And it could be defined however residents want to define it, by an area around a park, around a school, between the freeway and the river, whatever people want to talk about. Communities of interest, the new law got very specific in defining this. So you can see the elections code section reference there. The key phrase is there in the blue, community of interest is a population that shares a common social or economic interest. And then this is the key part, that should be included within a single district for purposes of its effective and fair representation. So there may be a shared common interest, but the folks in that area don't feel like they need to all be in one trustee area. We get, coming back to it again, we get that a lot from large active senior communities like Sun City developments. Like, well, we're clearly shared interests, but you know, the elected officials listen to us. When turnout is 99%, elected officials tend to listen. So they often will say we'd actually rather be in multiple seats. And so please divide us. Now, obviously you have to be large to do that. And we have the neighborhood restriction before this that limits what we can do on that front. But that is it's a two-part question. What is the community of interest when residents are giving us this input? And does it benefit from being all in one seat? So they have a large voice in electing who represents them, but they only have a voice in one trustee area. So it's a trade-off. And there's no right or wrong answer for that. People may disagree. And then you can see the language below in the examples is straight out of the statute. So it could be any kind of shared public policy concern, could be shared socioeconomics. The one that comes up there is a lot of, if you have an area that is heavily English as a second language. So an interest in that comes up a lot, or income or renters. Then you can see voter registration rates, voter turnout rates, and or shared histories. So a community that historically has been underrepresented, maybe have a shared history that makes it a community of interest. So that's all straight out of the law. The key factor at the bottom there was it can't be an area defined by the neighbors of an elected official. It's not, our shared interest is we really like incumbent X and we want to keep them. That's the only thing the law rules out for communities of interest. So lots of factors to consider. This is the kind of options I showed last time as well. Here we have our elementary school district boundary. Obviously you got Mountain House over in the west, and Mountain House School District over in the west. And then the eastern side of it is different. We also have freeways, you can see in the bottom left. Those could be very clear. Obviously there are clear major geographic features. They could also be considered neighborhood boundaries by some. And then you've got your Mountain House planned areas, and then counties versus places. I mentioned the area of Tracy, incorporated Tracy may consider itself a community of interest that wanted to be considered. Then, make sure I didn't skip something. Yeah. In terms of residents getting involved, so I mentioned all those maps are available on the website, and this link is on the school district website to the interactive review map. This is a map review tool, not a map creation tool. So this is where, as you zoom in, you can see when we're looking district-wide, like we are in this screenshot, you can see the boundaries of the defined neighborhoods in Mountain House. And then when grayed out below it, as you zoom in, those become active layers, and you can see all those different socioeconomic and citizen voting age percentage numbers. And once the draft maps are ready, they will go here as well. So residents, in that top bar with the magnifying glass, you can search for your address, and the map will zoom in on your address, so you'd immediately see where you are. And you can check the different boxes for the different maps to easily compare the different maps that will be made and presented there. So that's a quick spin through all this, looking at demographics, criteria, and possible neighborhoods or communities. But ultimately, the goal of this hearing is to get any community input on what are the communities and neighborhoods that should be considered in this, and then any direction you wish to give at this point. So happy to take questions now or after the hearing part.
I see that that we have some members of the public here, and so I don't have blue cards, but did you wish to speak at the hearing or ask questions? Okay, so I don't see any comments from the community. Is there any questions by the board this time?
None from me, thank you.
See no questions, so I believe,
I'll just say then,
thank you so much for your presentation.
hopefully everyone will tune in and check the district website in 2 days when those maps will appear.
In 2 days, you said?
Yeah.
Okay,
We have to move fast.
yeah, all right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Moving on to item 9, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn.
Second.
Based on a motion by trustee Pombo and seconded by trustee Clements, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We are adjourned with 4 ayes, no noes, and 1 absent.
Thank you.
6:23 PM.